Hi, I'm Megan Van Emmen, Extension Beef Cattle Specialist with Montana State University. In today's webinar, we are going to be discussing carcass characteristics and measurements in your beef cattle. So there are different measurements that can be collected. One, we have raw measurements, and then we have some calculations we can do based on those measurements. So the measurements that we collect typically, if we are going to go into a packing plant to grade carcasses, is the end live weight, the hot carcass weight, the back fat, kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, ribeye area, and quality grade. Although specifically not a measurement, it is more of a color depiction. We can determine if those animals are dark cutters. The calculations that we can then determine based on these measurements we have collected, we have the dressing percentage, yield grade, and cutability. So to give just a brief history lesson here on carcass grading, so basically back in 1924 the USDA established its first set of grading standards for slaughter beef, and by 1927 those official grading criteria for those beef carcasses by the USDA began on a voluntary basis. Now federal inspectors are in each plant to grade carcasses based on quality and yield grades to offer premiums and discounts based on those gradings. So to just do a brief run through, there are two types of grading. The first being quality grade, which is based on marbling or intramuscular fat, and maturity. So maturity is based on the age of the animal, and when I say age, many times it's not based on the actual year of birth. It a lot of times is based on the color of the lean muscle tissue as well as the ossification of the bones. The second is yield grade, and this is used to estimate the carcass cutability or yield of boneless closely trimmed retail cuts. So how much meat product are we going to get from that carcass? So we'll first start with quality grade and marbling. So that is the amount and distribution of fat within the lean. It's estimated between the 12th and 13th ribs after cutting and allowing at least 30 minutes for what we consider a bloom time. So degrees of marbling and marbling scores. So there are several quality grades we can determine based on an A maturity animal, or those steers that are commonly being used for our steaks and things like that from the feedlot. So the lowest degree of marbling is practically devoid, and traces, which is considered a standard, so very, very few flecks of marbling or little to no marbling in that steak. Then we move up to a slight, which is our selects, and so that has a little bit more marbling within that steak. Then we have small, modest, and moderate, which are our choice quality grades. So small being a choice minus, modest being choice average, moderate being choice plus. And then we have slightly abundant, moderately abundant, and abundant. So very heavily marbled, which are our prime quality grades. And we have prime minus, prime average, and prime plus. Now typically in our premiums and discounts, prime is included as a single premium, similar to choice, depending on if you're looking at something like a certified animal for a certain program, such as like certified Angus beef. We can determine, this may be determined based on a choice average or better. Then we have select minus and select plus, and then standard is just considered standard. So to look at pictures that go along with our quality grades, in the top left here we have a traces. So as you can see, there's very, very little flecking of marbling within this steak. Now we don't consider these large flecks as part of that marbling score. And as we can also see, which we'll get into more in yield grade, very little back fat up here. Thinner animal, not quite finished. Then we move into our two slights or our selects. you can see as we get through here, there's a few more flecks in here. Once again, we don't consider these larger flecks of fat. A little more in the select plus. Then we move into small or choice minus. Few more flecks. Choice average at modest. Once again, now if we don't look at these large flecks here, but you can see all these little finer flecks as you look at this picture. Moderate or choice plus. And as we move along in here, you can see that the back fat gets a little bit thicker as we move up in our marbling scores. So looking at all these little flecks in here, not considering once again, these larger fat deposits. Now we move into prime. Now this is where the back fat really starts to increase in our ribs here. Looking at our, even just prime minus to prime plus, we can see the huge increase in the number of fleckings of marbling that are in those steaks. So the marbling of the quality grade is basically insinuating tenderness and flavor. So as you increase marbling in the steak, it's considered to be more tender piece of beef, as well as a better eating experience. Now, if we're going to look at maturity, so this is the physiological age of the animal, not the year and month that animal was born. And it's classified with the letters A through E, A being an animal under 30 months of age, and B through E being considered animals above 30 months of age, which we'll get into here in just a moment. To evaluate maturity, we look at skeletal ossification and lean maturity. So when we're looking at our skeletal structure, we're looking for ossification of the cartilage, which we will give some examples here in a moment, and then lean maturity, which is the color and texture of the lean. So if we're looking strictly at lean maturity here, A, or those young animals under 30 months of age, being on the left, and the older animals, cull cows, bulls, things like that, on the right, or E maturity. And as seen in this picture, we go from a nice bright red color down to the older animals being a really dark burgundy color. That is how that muscle color changes as that animal ages. Now, when we consider bone ossification, we're looking at the vertebra and the thoracic buttons. So those A maturity animals, no ossification can be seen, and we can see distinct separation between the sacral vertebra. And as we increase in maturity, you will see greater ossification, and those sacral vertebrae have become completely fused. Now, this is why we consider bone ossification a more accurate measurement of physiological age, because some of our young animals, based on genetics and other factors, may actually appear to be older physiologically than they actually are by month and day. I have seen some feedlot animals that I knew based on their birth date should be under 30 months of age. However, based on bone ossification, they were actually appearing to be a B maturity. So just keep that in mind if you get a chance to go into a packing plant. Some of these younger animals just may appear to be older, and this is why we use bone ossification instead of a month and day of birth, or a month and year of birth. So this is an example of our bone ossification. So with the younger animal on the left, we see these nice white crisp vertebrae. Ossification really hasn't set in. Then as we age the animal, you see the yellow appearance of the bones, and then these vertebrae are completely ossified as we move from A maturity to E maturity. Now, based on maturity and the degrees of marbling. So we have degrees of marbling along the left, maturity along the top. A maturity can be prime, choice, select, and standard. Even B maturity, we can have these quality grades. So those younger animals can be graded with a quality grade, that we would typically see in the meat case, such as uh, choice beef, prime beef, things like that. Some of those brands that utilize these quality grades for their strict standards. Now, as we increase to C maturity and beyond, we can only grade those as commercial utility and cutters. So those older animals, those cull cows, cull bulls. Now let's take these two pictures here and let's just evaluate those animals that we would think based on a quality grade. So we have a fatter animal up here on the top left portion. We can see those fat pockets. We can't see any ribs. Brisket's looking like it's pretty full. And then in the bottom right, we have that animal that's not quite finished. He looks good, heavily probably muscled based on his appearance, but not a lot of fat around that tail head. The brisket really isn't full. Now, we still can't see those ribs, but we just can't see the fill of that animal like we can in this top left picture. So the big thing to know, though, is we don't know what that animal will look like until harvest time, or if we use ultrasound technology. So we are not sure whether or not this animal would grade a Choice Plus, or this one would, down in here in the bottom right, would have a lower quality standard, such a lower quality grade such as standard. This can be based on what they're being fed, as well as their environment and their genetics. I just err on the side of caution because genetics can play a huge role, and what they're being fed can play a large role in their quality grade. And so just because this animal appears to be fat does not mean he has internalized that fat to be marbling. So that's one thing to keep in mind. We won't know the quality grade of this animal unless this animal is unless this animal is harvested, or ultrasound technology is used to estimate his quality grade based on his marbling score. Now let's move into yield grade. It's a range between 1 and 5 and includes back fat, kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, hot carcass weight, and ribeye area. So we need these 4 measurements to determine yield grade. So to collect our back fat and ribeye measurements, this is done at the 12th and 13th ribs. So just to give you an example here on this steak, so we have this steak here, as we can see this ribeye, and 3/4 of the way down the top of the ribeye, we are going to measure back fat right here. Then to measure the area of the ribeye, we have a grid, and we place this grid on top of the steak, and we count these interior dots. Now, as you can see, there are these outlines that are already set up in square inches, so we do our best to place these grids within that ribeye, and then we can count these interior and exterior dots. So one thing to keep in mind, it is difficult because we do have these dots where they're not fully covered in a square, and this may depend on the person measuring on how they will account for these. Some may count them, some may not. Some may count every other one, because roughly half of that in some of these little squares does have lean tissue in it. So you can count these boundary dots and divide them by 2, and then you add in all your interior dots. So if you have 100 dots on the interior, you've counted 9 of these exterior dots. You're going to divide by 2, and because each of these dots represents a tenth of a square inch, so we have 100 plus 9 divided by 2 times 0.1 gets us to 10.45 square inches of ribeye in this example. So here's the equation for yield grade. So it's a set equation based on the USDA recommendations. So it's 2.5 plus 2.5 times back fat in square inches plus 0.2 times kidney, pelvic, and heart fat in percent plus 0.0038 times hot carcass weight in pounds minus 0.32 times ribeye area in square inches. So for an example, if we have one carcass with a hot carcass weight of 801 pounds, 2.5% kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, 0.3 inches of back fat, and 12.5 square inches. In carcass 2, same hot carcass weight, same kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, but this animal has 0.6 inches of back fat and only 9.8 square inches of ribeye area. So if we utilize this calculation based on our yield grade in these individual measurements, we have a yield grade for carcass 1 of 2.79 and a yield grade of 4.41 for the second carcass. Now, one thing to keep in mind, yield grade is based on a whole number score of 1 to 5. So this is a little bit different than how you would normally think of math. We round down to the nearest whole number. So carcass 1 would be a yield grade 2. Carcass 2 would be a yield grade 4. So that is one thing to keep in mind with yield grade. You round down to the nearest whole number. So to give you an example of some yield grades, so we have a yield grade 1 here on the left picture. We can see just a little bit of back fat, pretty large ribeye area. Now from this we do not know kidney, pelvic, and heart fat because we're just looking at the rib here. But back fat is a decent indicator of yield grade based on degree of finish, because usually as back fat increases, ribeye area gets smaller, therefore increasing our yield grade number. So we have a yield grade 1. In the middle we have a yield grade 3. We can see that ribeye is a little bit smaller, a little bit more back fat. And then a yield grade 5, extremely large back fat, fairly small ribeye area. So in a pinch, we can use back fat as a single measurement to estimate our yield grade. Now, another calculation we can do is dressing percentage, which is just hot carcass weight divided by live weight times 100%. So we have carcass A weighed 1,300 pounds live weight and had an 806 pound carcass weight. Carcass B also weighed 1,300 pounds but had only a 741 pound carcass weight. So if we calculate this out, carcass A has a 62% dressing percentage and carcass B only has a 57% dressing percentage. 62% is about average for the feedlot industry. Now, moving into cuttability, just another measurement to look at, very similar to yield grade. So once again, a set equation. We do not alter this equation. So 51.34 minus 5.78 times back fat in inches minus 0.462 times kidney, pelvic, and heart fat in percent minus 0.0093 times hot carcass weight in pounds plus 0.74 times ribeye area in square inches. So we're going to look at those same carcasses that we did in the yield grade example. So this just gives us another estimation of boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts, or how much actual meat product are we going to receive from each carcass. So carcass 1, 50.25%. In carcass 2, 46.52%. So for carcass 1, approximately 50% of that carcass is going to be meat product that we can consume. For carcass 2, only about 46.5% of that carcass is going to be able to be consumed. So this just keeps us in mind that as the animal gets fatter, your carcass cutability typically goes down because of that increased back fat and other fat content, such as kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. That is internal fat that is actually removed and is not part of the meat product. So let's look at a couple more examples here. So if we look at the picture in the top left, we have an animal. He looks very muscular, even has a little bit of tail fat right up here. You can't see any ribs. His brisket is starting to fill in, but just doesn't have the fat cover that the bottom right picture does. But as we just previously discussed, fat content doesn't necessarily mean a high yielding animal. So this animal is extremely fleshy, very high amounts of tailhead fat, brisket is full, very large fat cover over the rib section here. So if we think about it in terms of yield grade or cutability, this top left animal is going to have a high cutability, high yielding, because he does not have the fat cover that this animal has down here in the bottom right. However, marbling is another thing we have to consider. Is this animal finished? Are we going to get a good eating experience out of those steaks that are going to come out of him? Is he going to grade select, or is he going to grade prime or choice? We just don't know that at this point in time. And that's one thing about harvesting animals, is that's how you can directly measure your quality grades as well. And or you can use ultrasound technology to estimate this. So to give you an example of a plant printout, if you're retaining ownership, or if you are sending your animals to the feedlot, you may receive a plant printout based on your lot of cattle that entered the plant that day. So this is just an example. Some may change and have different measurements available for you. Some have actually moved into video pictures for direct ribeye measurements and things like that. It depends on the plant you go to. But, you'll have your information up here. The big one, when were they harvested, how many went, and then we have our premiums and discounts for that day. So we have the prime select spread, the choice select spread, yield grade 1, 2, and 3, yield grades 4s and 5s. Now, yield grade 3 is considered average, so there is no discount or premium, and as you reduce the number of yield grade, which increases cutability, you receive a premium for that. But as you get into a 4 and a 5, you get a discount. And this is because you're reducing the amount of product coming from that animal as you get into a yield grade 4 and a 5. Now, standard for quality grade, pretty heavy discount, $15 a hundredweight. Dark cutters, $25 a hundredweight. Dark cutters are an indicator of stress on that animal. So these dark cutters will be, especially in a young animal, will be that dark burgundy color when they are harvested and those steaks are allowed to bloom. And we don't want that because it is an indicator of tougher meat due to that stress factor. You get discounted for lightweight carcasses, overweight carcasses, and any commercial animals that come through. And commercial is in the quality grade, not as in just commercial-based product. Now, then you'll receive kind of a table like this. What was the plant average? How did your animals perform based on the plant average? How much of a variance was there? How much difference was there between the plant average and your cattle? What price standards were used? So, if we take this printout for an example, Percent, we'll just look at quality grade right now. Prime, Choice, Select, Standard, Commercial. So just the top 5 lines. Based on this producer's cattle, about 2.5% graded Prime, about 80% graded Choice, about 17% graded Select, about 1% graded Standard, no commercials. The Prime, little bit less than plant average. Choice, though, much greater than Choice average. Right about average for the plant on the Selects, less, lower than plant average for Standards. So what I am interpreting here is that about 83% of those animals graded Choice or better. That is a very good standard to shoot for. We can see the discounts and premiums over here that would have been received. Now let's look at yield grade 1, the yield grades here, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So yield grade 1's about 0.5% graded 1, about 16% graded 2, about 79% graded 3, and then about 5% 4 and 5. So checking out the plant averages, for yield grade 3s or better, which means a 3 to a 1, we're talking in that 95% range getting average or a premium. Only about 5% of those had received a discount, and which is still well below plant average. Those animals were right about finished is how I would consider this. No dark cutters, no lightweight animals. Now you might receive, depending on where you send your animals, this is a percent certified Angus beef, so how many those animals met the criteria for certified Angus beef, so about 39%. And then heavyweight carcasses, greater than 1,049 pounds. So about 3% of those animals. This is becoming a little bit bigger of a discount because feed has been relatively cheap, and we have been able to feed those animals for longer to guarantee better quality grades. However, this also pushes your hot carcass weights up over 1,050, which a lot of plants were not made to carry that capacity of animals. And so discounts have been starting to be applied to those heavy carcasses. So from down here, we can see you'll get a summary of the plant premium and discounts you would have received. So weight premiums. So the low price for those animals was $151.52, which probably indicates some of these heavyweight carcasses, yield grade 4s and 5s, and things like that. High price would be $182.48, which would most likely be your prime animals and your yield grade 1s. But then they'll also give you this other information here about what was your average live weight? Well, 1,481. Dressing percent, so it's about 63% for dressing percentage. Average carcass weight was 928. And then total live pounds and total carcass pounds, which is how they calculate your dressing percentage. So you can get some of these printouts and you can determine where maybe you should place emphasis on some of your breeding in the future to improve carcass weights or carcass characteristics based on some of the plant characteristics you're receiving back. So take a look at these if you can receive them and see if some selection criteria need to be changed for your bulls. And this is if you're focusing on your steer calves. But just something to keep in mind, you can get some of this data back from the plant or the feedlot, and so you can make better selection criteria in the future if you're going to sell those steers direct to a feedlot. With that, I'm Megan Van Emmen, Extension Beef Cattle Specialist with Montana State University. Thanks and have a great day.